Hello, my name is Sheehy Skeffington, and I'm delighted to be a part of this panel on the psychological impact of poverty. And I'm going to use it as an opportunity to present just my general research approach to understanding decision making in the context of poverty, with a little bit of empirical evidence as an example. So, often the reason why we're called on to talk about decision making and the cognitive impacts of poverty is because of reliable observations that the lower one is in socioeconomic status, the less likely one is to behave in wise ways, in ways that help one's life outcomes. Those lower in SES or poor are more likely to eat unhealthy food and engage in smoking and excessive drinking, less likely to engage in exercise, more likely to make smart financial decisions, and less likely to invest in and do well in academic contexts. Now, despite the presence of a number of important environmental barriers for example, doing well in academic context, being able to get exercise, having access to affordable, healthy food, there's nevertheless an observation that when presented with the same choice, those on lower incomes are less likely to make the so-called the correct choice. And we see where this plays out in terms of judgments made by public discourse and policymakers about the kinds of decisions those experiencing poverty, in particular those receiving welfare benefits, should be making. And this also has implications for the kind of interventions that are brought to bear, which are specifically individual level when focused through this lens, whether it's providing more information or getting people into the right mindset. As former Prime Minister David Cameron says here, you know, people in receipt of government benefits need to become more like us, the real us, hardworking, pioneering, independent, creative, adaptable, optimistic, and can do. So there's a sense that there's something wrong with the decisions that people are making in poverty, and from that point of view, it's their own fault that they're not getting themselves out of this poverty trap. Now, decades of research has done a lot of work to move beyond these pejorative assumptions and stigmatizing views, in particular by looking at the impact of poverty on cognition. Some really important work has looked at the role of extreme deprivation in impairing the developing brain. But also, more recent work in behavioral economics has used experimental methods to induce, even in middle-income participants, temporary experiences of components of poverty, in particular resource scarcity. And these researchers have found that even middle-income participants experiencing scarcity or low-income people made to think about financial strain perform worse on cognitive tasks than they would if they were not thinking about financial strain or not experiencing scarcity in a game. So this implies that poverty impedes cognitive function, to choose the title of one of the papers here. My own approach takes a socio-ecological perspective. This draws on research both from behavioral ecology and also from socio-ecological psychology. And in that, we try to understand decision-making processes and their functioning in response to salient environmental cues that organisms are facing. And I look at low SES contexts in terms of three key cues: resource scarcity, obviously, not being able to have the resources one needs, and the inability to do what you want as a result of that; instability, and with that, not being able to predict what's going to happen; and then low social valuation, which is really a combination of things: low status in society, a sense of exclusion from society, and then also often living in deprived neighborhoods where there is a breakdown in social trust. And all of these are together because they all impede our ability to have reliable cooperation partners in our context. And this also matters for the kinds of decisions and risks and investment in the future that we can make. And what I'm going to argue is that decisions made in context of poverty could result from a psychological shift in response to these cues, and that resulting behaviors that may seem suboptimal are in fact rational when considered in the context of poverty. So the domain I'll focus on is cognition, and I'll use the broad term of domain-specific cognitive focus as what might be happening in response to these cues, just as a chance to present you a snapshot of this research. The broad argument runs along these lines: to the extent that we are facing these cues, or a person is facing these cues, for example, in an experimental context where they're made instability or resource scarcity is made salient to them. When a conventional cognitive task is then presented to them, their mind should be elsewhere. Their cognitive processes should be focused on addressing the domain that's under threat, whether they're experiencing a status threat or scarcity or instability. And so one shouldn't be focused on that cognitive task. And one might see impaired performance as one does. But if one presents tasks that involve either stimuli or rewards that actually fit into the domain under threat, that provide a way of helping one to regain a scarce resource or a lost social valuation, then that task should be seen as highly relevant. And in those cases, we might see as good, if not better, performance. And if that's the case, it seems that the cognitive processes involved are not damaged by the situation of poverty, but attuned to address the needs that it presents. So one way I've looked at this is in the case of scarcity in food. This is some work I did while at Brunel University. And what we did is we had participants come into the lab after having fasted for 12 hours. We randomly assigned half of them to have breakfast. And this is a classic design for looking at the impact of hunger on cognitive functioning. And classically, what's found is that hunger leads to worse cognitive performance. The variation we added was whether the measures that people completed involved food stimuli versus not. So one of the tasks is a short-term memory task where we had participants try to remember a list of 15 words. Of these, 5 of them were food related. Then we had matched emotion and neutral words. And of course, they were mixed up and not color coded like this. We also had a visual search task where we varied in the stimuli that the participant needed to search for. So in this version, it would be find the kebab. In a matched version, the exact same array would be presented with a matched clothing item. So it would be find the boot, for example, if it was a bit of clothing. And we had arrays of multiple sizes. Participants did 64 trials in this visual search task, and the target stimuli were matched across condition for visual complexity and familiarity. And what we find when we just look at the non-food versions of these tasks, for example, in the memory task, is that we do have the classic finding of those having fasted, being hungry and not having eaten, performing worse, remembering fewer words. But when it comes to food-related words, they're performing no worse. In fact, it almost looks like they're performing better here. And there's a similar pattern when it comes to the visual search task. Here, everybody is faster to find food items as opposed to clothing items, but this facilitation effect, this greater speed, is stronger among the hungry group. So here again, better performance among those in the hungry versus sated condition. Another way I've looked at this is, so that was resource scarcity. What about low social valuation? How I varied that in my research, and this is more kind of earlier PhD and postdoc research, is to shift people's perceptions of where they sit in society. So after gathering a range of demographic information, giving them false feedback about where they sit, which means that regardless of their actual income, participants are led to believe that they're either relatively low in SES or relatively high in SES, depending on their condition. And what I find here is that if you're low in SES, and in this version I administered a number of cognitive tasks, you perform worse here on the Stroop task, a measure of inhibitory control, also on the Tubac task, also on the Tariff-Hanoi task and the Tubac task. Tariff-Hanoi, a measure of planning, and the Tubac task, a measure of working memory updating. I also showed this with a financial decision-making task that was designed specifically to draw on these executive functions that seem to be impaired in the low SES condition. But then subsequent work, and this is the critical variation, Michael Price and collaborators and I thought, well, what happens if we change the relevance of the task? If we now present these cognitive tasks as not just measures of executive function linked to prefrontal brain activity, but as linked to potentially later life gains in SES. So we just present real evidence for the importance of executive function for socioeconomic status. But importantly, in this case, it makes the same cognitive task suddenly relevant to people who are facing a status threat, who've just been given a prime made salient that they are low in status in relation to others in society. In the low relevance condition, similar to the other studies, thinking you're low in SES leads to worse performance. But if the same cognitive task is presented as relevant to gains in SES, that leads to no performance decrement in the low SES condition. As this effect was small, we replicated it with the D2 test of attention with the same relevance and SES manipulations and found a similar pattern. Just smaller, worse performance in the low SES condition when the task is not relevant, but indeed better performance in the low SES condition if the task is framed as relevant to later life gains in SES. So this is just a snapshot of evidence as part of a broader framework that I'm developing, understanding socioeconomic strain in terms of low social valuation, instability, and resource scarcity. Now, a critical mediating variable to all of this, which I haven't had time to talk about, is perceptions of personal control. For all of these reasons, when experiencing all of these threats, these impede one's ability to be able to control one's outcomes. Not necessarily to control one's behaviors, but the impact that one's behavior has on one's life outcomes. So response efficacy, not so much self-efficacy. And that matters because one should only invest in the future or focus cognitive resources on something that one knows will be worthwhile. So there's a kind of cognitive specialization, some of which I've shown you there, some of which plays out in terms of different kinds of executive functions in wider work and work done by others in this field. I've also looked at this in terms of self-regulation, in particular applying ideas from construal level theory to investigate the extent to which there's a shift to the here and now that happens in response to these cues, which would mean that one does make decisions that harm, that impede the ability to achieve later goals in the future, but help one in the immediate present. And we're also looking at emotional dimension of poverty with some students in my lab and affective responses as adaptive and the role that these play in understanding some of these decision-making patterns. So just to summarize, I think the behavioral demands placed on those living in poverty need to appreciate the psychological impact of socioeconomic strain. I've talked about that in terms of these three cues: scarcity, instability, and low social valuation. And this can lead to a shift in core psychological processes, like ongoing research looking at this. This results in behaviors that are rational in context, even if they are harmful to long-term life outcomes. And what I think this offers us is a chance to motivate interventions targeting the wider context of poverty, what it is that leads people to not have enough resources, to not be able to predict their income, to feel excluded by society and not valued by society, as opposed to just trying to target and change what are in fact understandable psychological responses to it. So I'll just end by thanking those who funded this work, and I look forward to joining the discussion with you all.